last session we looked at the 4 arguments against LDS truth claims that arise or are based on polygamy. The first argument is that polygamy is never commanded by God. Joseph Smith claimed God commanded him to practice it. A prophet or apostle does not lie about receiving a commandment. Joseph lied about God commanding him to practice or institute polygamy. Therefore, Joseph Smith is not a prophet or apostle. We went through extensive evidence from Old Testament, New Testament, and LDS-specific scripture showing that premise A was unsupported. We went through premise B extensively as well and showed the timeline that showed that Joseph Smith clearly claimed that God commanded him to practice polygamy. In fact, he claimed that he did so via an angel 4 different times over the period of 1835 to 1841. So this was clearly supported. So really this argument comes up a lot when, and people may not state it like this, polygamy is never commanded by God, but they'll state it like, the God I believe in would never command this to happen because it's so difficult, something like that. And really they're making this argument, right? Polygamy is never commanded by God. They're stating explicitly that it's their feeling that the God that they believe in, who's all loving, would never command something that is so difficult. This is the argument they're making. And clearly, again, from LDS specific and New Testament, Old Testament, it is unsupported. The question comes is why, and we have various answers to that. Specific trial, theologically it was important, all these different potential whys, but really this is the main argument from polygamy. Argument 2 is it talks about how it's practiced, and again you won't find it laid out like this. What you'll see instead is a laundry list of Joseph Smith married 14-year-olds. He married people that were married to had other husbands, and they won't state implicit assumptions. So what we're trying to do is pull out implicit assumptions. So what they're saying when they're saying that Joseph Smith married 14-year-olds is they're arguing this, that even if polygamy was commanded, like in theory, right, he would command that you could only marry women that were of a certain age, and they would insert whatever they felt comfortable with. Why? Because polygamy always includes sex, and we're very concerned about sex with minors. And then Joseph married girls under 15 years old, therefore Joseph's polygamy could not have been commanded by God. So we went through the evidence, and we looked at the 2 14-year-olds, for example, and we showed that most of the evidence pointed to the conclusion that polygamy didn't always include sex. It certainly didn't with people that had other husbands at the time, and if it followed the Utah policy, it wouldn't include sex until the women were 18 years old. That seems to have, we looked at Helen Mar Kimball, extensive evidence from her, and talked about premise A being unsupported. The third argument is based on the practice of polyandry. Did Joseph Smith actually practice real polyandry? So he was sealed to people that already had husbands, and the easy conclusion is that in these marriages, Joseph Smith practiced polyandry. But we looked at that and we showed that actually the evidence pointed to the fact that these were not earthly marriages. They didn't live with them. There was no sexual relations. That they lived with their legal spouses. There's something else was going on here. We looked at a few reasons why these could have occurred. Finally, the fourth argument is about Joseph's institution of the practice in his relationship with Emma, and we went through and showed how difficult it was for Emma, and so we went through the story as well as we can reconstruct, which is difficult because we lack a lot of documentation, and we discussed about how he could have told her. We don't know when she for sure had knowledge of it, that she was consenting at times and unconsenting at times, and we talked about their conference that brought both of them to tears and their compromise. So this again is based on the character of Joseph. In other words, if he was told to practice it, he should have practiced it in a certain way. So we went through those 4, and that's of course on YouTube. So next we want to turn to arguments from translations, Book of Mormon, Abraham, etc. First is the Book of Mormon. I'm pulling these directly from the letter of the CS director. I'm using it because it's an easy source. These aren't new, but it's an easy thing, and for some reason people think that it is new, so it's easy to use. So these are his 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, quoting Mr. Runnels here. And we're just going to walk through them. These are covered in other sessions, but I want to be clear where we covered them, how, and point people to there. So number 1 is, what are the 1769 King James Version edition errors doing in the Book of Mormon? An ancient text, ? Errors which are unique to the 1769 edition that Joseph Smith owned, ? So implicit in this critique, right, in these questions, is that the translation was a literalist equivalence, right? That the language should have been what was on the plate text. There should be a literal equivalence to the plate text. This assumption we talked about being contrary to all the evidence, both from the text itself, from Joseph, from Brigham. There is nobody connected with the translation besides a few of the witnesses to the translation which think it's inerrant or literalist at all. So we covered this extensively in sessions 10, 11. We spent 2 hours on it. He's actually understating the case here. We looked at things like, why would there be modern idioms, right? So we use this as evidence that it wasn't a literalist equivalent. So if I was writing this for him, I would have put number 2 or 1a, why are there modern idioms in the Book of Mormon, an ancient text? What does that mean about it being an ancient text, right? So clearly the assumption here is that it's a literalist equivalent, not a functional translation, despite all the evidence being that it is in fact a functional translation. Similarly, so this is very similar to number 1, but number 2, when King James translators were translating the KJV Bible, they would occasionally put in their own words in the text to make the English more readable. We know exactly what these words are because they're italicized in the KJV Bible. What are these 17th century italicized words doing in the Book of Mormon? Word for word. What does this say about the Book of Mormon being an ancient record? Again, it's the same assumption that we have going on here, that it's a literalist equivalent translation, despite all evidence to the contrary.
The evidence is Joseph Smith just using what he knew to be.
Well, it's clear that he's actually, when he's looking at, for example, the Isaiah chapters, it's actually clear that he's messing with the italicized words, because sometimes he replaces those and changes those a bit. So again, we talked about different theories of how the translation process occurred just a little bit, and I pointed to one book that has an interesting theory. But he's clearly seeing something when he's translating, and in these cases he was seeing the KJV text, and that was coming, most people think from him. And of course he didn't have a view of translation where there was some perfect translation either, that we're going to get to that. He didn't view translation as being something that was dictated specifically and correctly from God at all times. This goes here, number 3. The Book of Mormon includes what he calls mistranslated biblical passages that were later changed in Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible. These Book of Mormon verses should match the inspired JST version instead of the incorrect KJV version that Joseph later fixed. Right? So what he's doing here is he's saying, look, if Joseph Smith later produced a Joseph Smith translation that used a translation of these verses in a specific way, that should also be in the Book of Mormon. Again, so he's assuming the translation was either inerrant, right, that it was always correct. He's also assuming a version of translation that only allows for one translation. When Joseph Smith, that was clearly not his view of translation. So he said sometimes, I could render a plainer translation, but this is sufficient. He didn't view the JST as replacing the King James version, which we don't currently use the JST we use it alongside sometimes. They're both profitable. So he viewed translation in just a very different way. That certain verses could be rendered one way and profitably for one way and in a different way. So this idea that there was a quote-unquote correct or a mistranslated biblical passage is just foreign to Joseph Smith's ideas of translation. All right, DNA analysis has concluded that Native American Indians do not originate from the Middle East or from Israelites, but rather from Asia. Why did the church change the following section of the introduction page in the 2006 edition of the Book of Mormon? Shortly after DNA results were released from the Lamanites, and they are the principal ancestors of the American Indians, to the Lamanites, and they are among the ancestors of the American Indians. Most likely that was changed because church headquarters figured out that that was a bad introduction and was not in correlation to the text. So again, this criticism assumes that we could locate the genetic signature of Lehi's family in modern populations. The very idea of locating the genetic signature of Lehi's family in modern populations constitutes a truly untestable hypothesis. I talked about this extensively in session 15, since it's not possible to know the nature of the genetic profiles. We went through population drift, bottlenecks, all these type of concepts that need to be understood. So we talked about DNA analysis as being kind of a red herring for both proponents and detractors. Archaeology. His claim there's absolutely no archaeological evidence to directly support the Book of Mormon or the Nephite Lamanites who numbered in the millions. This is one of the reasons why unofficial apologists are coming up with a limited geography model. It happened in Central or South America, and the real Hill Cumorah is not in Palmyra, New York, but is elsewhere and possibly somewhere down there instead. This is in direct contradiction to what Joseph Smith and other prophets have taught. Never mind that the church has a visitor center there in New York and holds annual Hill Cumorah pageants. This criticism is baffling to me, depending, of course, what you mean by directly. Of course, we don't have a stone saying, Zarahemla, but we went through 8 hours, sessions 12 through 20, of archaeological, historical, linguistic evidence, including Nahum, Bountiful, that in fact do directly support Book of Mormon claims. So this one is, again, depending on what you mean by directly, if he means what he's requiring by that word directly is some, I don't know, I don't even know how we would recognize the word Nephite, since that's an English word that Joseph Smith has. I don't know what that would look like down there, but depending on what you mean by directly, this is just, it's hard to know what again, these people are reading if they're not, they don't ever deal with the 8 hours of material that I presented. They never talk about Gardner's book or Sorensen's work or anything like that. So clearly not dealing with the scholarship. As far as a limited geography model, we talked about that, how, for a long time, general readership didn't read the text very accurately, didn't read the text very closely, and a lot of people had hemispheric views of it. And once you read the text, you realize that that's impossible. I don't think the lack of archaeological evidence is the reason for that. In fact, the reason for that is just the reading of the text. And the reading of the text actually then brings forth archaeological evidence. So, I'm not sure what that means, but I don't want to paraphrase him. I want to allow his words to speak. So, related to this criticism are criticisms from Mesoamerican experts, such as Michael Coe. He gave an interview to Mormon Stories, which is John DeLynne's podcast, which you can listen to here. Michael Coe is a Mesoamerican expert. Most often the issue that we see here is that the scholars or experts have expertise in Mesoamerica, but if they've not sufficiently studied or grasped what the Book of Mormon reads and the text. So this leads to lots of problems. So for example, just to give you an example, in part 1, minute 24, Coe claims that maize, by the way, isn't really mentioned in the Book of Mormon. He's talking about issues with grains. And this is just patently false, right? The first mention of grain cultivation occurred nearly 400 years after they landed in the New World, and corn maize is explicitly the grain of choice when grain cultivation is mentioned, right? So we have in Mosiah 7:22, and all this he did for the sole purpose of bringing this people into subjection or into bondage, and behold, we at this time do pay tribute to the king of the Lamanites, to the amount of 1/2 of our corn, that is maize, and our barley, and of all grain of all kind. Mosiah 9:9 again, we can till the ground, ye even all men are seeds with seeds of corn. So it's clearly, maize is clearly the most important crop to them. The first time it's mentioned, and he's saying it isn't really mentioned in the Book of Mormon. So it's not that he's not an expert in Mesoamerica. He is. In fact, Sorensen quotes him more than 20 times in his Mormon Codex. The issue is he's not an expert in the Book of Mormon text. And so when you ask someone that's an expert in one thing to just apply their knowledge to something that they're not fully familiar with, you have issues. So if you're interested, for example, John Sorensen wrote an open letter to Coe that's here based on that interview where he tries to respectfully point out a number of issues with his comments about the Book of Mormon. Again, the issue is not with his expertise, and Sorensen quotes his work extensively in the Mormon's Codex. It's the issue of you have to have expertise in both of these things, and for a non-believer, there's no point for them, I guess, to get expertise in the Book of Mormon. So it's not bad that they don't, but it's just that it's hard for them to bring their expertise to bear. So, in summary, the arguments against or from the Book of Mormon rely on unsupported assumptions, such as A, that it's a literalist equivalence translation, and it's an inerrant process, or C, the book makes claims about all Native Americans, etc. Right? So, these arguments rely on unsupported assumptions in all cases. Attempts to provide a naturalistic explanation for the Book of Mormon. We talked about the lack of a singular unified theory from critics about how the Book of Mormon came about. We talked about a number of different theories. So go back and listen to those in sessions 10. But in general, they fail in two major ways. First, they mostly require extensive outside materials. I say mostly because, of course, some have proposed that Joseph Smith, a stream of consciousness spit it out. He was an autodidact. Some theory that required no extensive outside materials, but generally speaking, they require extensive outside materials, such as, right, the KJV's version of the Bible, right? He's relying on it to structure Isaiah, to use the language. I'm just putting in here what, for example, is in the CS letter, an 1808 map of Africa, dime novels by Stephen Burroughs and Captain Kidd for the word Moroni, the book View of the Hebrews, an 1819 textbook called The Late War Between the United States and Great Britain, and a book called The First Book of Napoleon. Now, the issue here is that we have all 6 witnesses to the translation process, including a person that was never baptized, Emma's brother, right, even antagonistic, that all agree that no outside materials were used or present during the translation. So if you're going to require extensive outside materials, you have 0 evidence, and in fact you're going against 6 material witnesses, including those with no bias whatsoever, that say there was nothing there, right? So it's difficult to do so. But perhaps even more importantly, no naturalistic explanation is provided for any of the complex correspondences that we covered in sessions 12 through 20. So those 8 hours, right? So what I'm saying is, even if you assume, right, that he did in fact have access to all of this, everything the critics say that he has access to, it doesn't actually explain what needs to be explained. The naturalistic explanations that we talked about, Nahum, Bountiful, on and on and on, right? These works don't do the trick, right? So I'm going to just show you, for example, here is what critics from the, again, CS letter, here's the view of the Hebrews. Here's the things that Joseph could have gotten from the view of the Hebrews. The destruction of Jerusalem, scattering of Israel, restoration of 10 tribes, Hebrews leaving the old world, religion a motivating factor, migration of a long journey, encountering seas of many waters, America's being uninhabited. That's actually not correct, right? The Book of Mormon implicitly requires inhabited land, so that's just wrong, but whatever. Settlers journey northward, encountering a valley of a great river, a unity of race, Hebrew settled land, or ancestral origin of American Indians, Hebrew, the origin of Indian language. Again, that's not correct according to the Book of Mormon. They're most likely speaking the native tongue and just writing in their sacred language. Egyptian hieroglyphics, Reformed Egyptian, lost Indian records, breastplate, man standing on the wall, warning the people, prophets, spiritually gifted men, gospel preached in the Americas. Quotes whole chapters of Isaiah, good and bad, pride, polygamy denounced, sacred high towers, Messiah visiting, idolatry, human sacrifice, Hebrew divided into classes, on and on and on. I just put these here. Again, you're not seeing anything that I described in those 8 hours, right? So if he has access, you're great. Even if you assume he's taking all of this from the view of the Hebrews, it doesn't solve the complex correspondences that we're noting, right? We don't have any information here about 600 BC in Jerusalem, for example. We talked about how that, Lehi's matching of the actual situation 600 BC. Arabian Peninsula, on and on and on. Now, late war between the United States and Great Britain. So if he has access to this, what can he get from it? Divisive and curious workmanship, a stripling soldier with his weapon of war in his hand. So that's supposed to be the stripling soldiers there. A certain chief captain, fortifications, the people are going to fortify themselves and trench the high places around the city. Again, but nothing specific. We talked extensively about fortifications and how specifically correlated they are. This just doesn't do it, or even close. Polished steels will find workmanship. 3 Indian prophets, rod of iron, war between the wicked and the righteous. Righteous Indian conversion of Indians. Bands of robbers, brass plates. Worthiness of Christopher Columbus, ships crossing the ocean. A battle at a fort with a white protagonist. Again, we talked about how there's nothing, the skin color is not mentioned in the Book of Mormon, and the idea that the curse of dark skin and white is a false reading. But regardless, cataclysmic earthquake, boats and barges, a bunch of it came to passes. So we could have gotten a lot of came to passes from there. First book of Napoleon, this is what he says, condemn not the writing, an account of the first book of Napoleon. Notice all these ellipses. When you actually read the first book of Napoleon, you have to go quite a bit to actually get all these little phrases. When you put it all together, then it'll kind of look like I didn't put it here. It looks like a passage in the Book of Mormon, but regardless, again, if he had the first book of Napoleon, he was like, I'm going to put together this passage, and so he could have gotten the foolish imagination of the heart, small in stature, Jerusalem, because of the perverse wickedness of the people. So, in summary, the critical argument, well, number 1, relies on assumptions, either literalistic and inerrant, for which there is no evidence, and are not assumed by anyone familiar with the scholarship. 2, makes claims about the writing process for which there is zero evidence, namely that he had outside materials, and directly contradicting evidence with 6 witnesses. And number 3, perhaps most importantly, even if those claims are assumed, does not actually provide the required naturalistic explanations. Session 20 has a review of all the complex correspondences that we covered from 12 through 19. And you'll notice as I went through, nothing there is actually explained. Right? So I have a very difficult time talking to critics. I would say, even if I assume all of your things, he has access to all those materials, it just still doesn't explain what I need explained, right? Still doesn't explain how he got all this right. That's the 3 the 3 points about the critical argument from the Book of Mormon. Any questions about, in general, the criticism of the Book of Mormon? All right, Book of Abraham. We see sessions 20 and 21. We covered this more in depth, so I want to point you there if you missed it. But in summary, the criticism relies on assumptions, again, that no one familiar with the scholarship holds. For example, that the Joseph Smith papyrus was a holograph rather than a manuscript, right? We talked about it, how written by the hand of Abraham on this. We talked about that criticism. And number 2, disputes the interpretations of the facsimiles. We talked pretty extensively about this issue of the facsimiles, but basically it's that Joseph's proffered explanations in general do not match standard Egyptological explanations. Now, the traditional approach from apologists is to focus on those that do match, or at least are even the same ballpark, and we talked about that. For example, the lion's death scene, we talked about hyposyphilis, but we also talked about how there's major problems with this approach with the facsimiles, right? We talked about, number 1, how ancient Egyptians would have interpreted. Number 1, the first problem being, most drawings, they don't label what characters mean. We talked about how John Gee has demonstrated that the few times we have found labels of various figures, they rarely match the labels Egyptologists gave the figures, right? So we just have these fundamental problems. Number 2, most of our knowledge comes from the 18th dynasty around 1500 BC. That's about 1,000 years after the papyrus that Joseph Smith was working with was created. So we have a huge time lapse there. Number 2, the big issue was, should we be comparing or really trying to understand how a small group of ancient Jews would have interpreted the drawings, right? So how the writer Abraham or later Jewish copyists meant to use them. So we do know that on many occasions Abraham's descendants took Egyptian elements of culture and applied their own meaning to them. So I talked to a couple examples. For example, in the Testament of Abraham, we have a vignette accompanying that, which is from chapter 125 of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, but it's reimagined in Semitic terms. So Osiris, sitting on the throne of judgment, becomes Abel. The Egyptian gods become Semitic angels. The scribe Thoth becomes a biblical Enoch. So we have lots of cases of people, the syncretization of religions, where they're taking elements of one religion and applying their own use to it. Is that what was happening with these? So we talked about that, and we said that, look, but most importantly, again, critics failed to provide any naturalistic explanation for any of the correspondences of the actual text of the Book of Abraham. Right? We talked about the actual text, and we showed, I don't even know how many, more than a dozen cases where it matches ancient sources that Joseph Smith did not have available to him about Abraham, and that were just not available to the world. So we talked about in sessions 20 and 21. So critics exclusively focus on the facsimiles, and we talked about the problems with doing that. We have issues of how they're understood or who they should be understood, and we still have some matches even regardless. But what they're failing to do is provide any natural explanation for what really needs to be explained, and that's the text. And there's zero even attempt that I can see of an attempt to provide a naturalistic explanation for the text. So just like the Book of Mormon, we get naturalistic explanations for things that we don't care about, right? We need naturalistic explanations for the things that are complex correspondences that were not available to Joseph Smith. And that's what we lack in both of these cases.
Could it also be that, didn't you say that it could have just been a translation experience like Enoch, where Joseph read something about Abraham and then it opened up?
Oh, yeah, we didn't talk at all about it having to come from the actual papyrus.
Yeah,
but the text itself matches. If you've seen sessions 20 and 21,
it's a while ago.
Okay, it matches details about Abraham that we find in later texts. So we're not even talking about.
You're not even. I got you.
Yeah, it doesn't have to come from the papyrus. The point is, we have this text. Somehow he gave us this text. How did he do that?
Gotcha.
How did he give us this text that matches? That's the issue. All right, argument against the Book of Enoch. This is anticlimactic, but despite the Book of Enoch being the most clear and accessible text, right? Because we have his text, and now we have source material claiming to be the books of Enoch. Critics have ignored the book and provided no natural explanation for any of the correspondence that we talked about in sessions 8 and 9. This is most puzzling to me from the critic's perspective, because it's the most clear and accessible test that we have. We have all these ancient books of Enoch that we found since Joseph Smith's day. He provides us with this very delectable test, and they completely ignore it. Maybe because, again, it matches. It's hard to criticize it, but I wanted to make that clear. Our next session, and the last session in this, will be on the Kinderhook Plates. All right. So the Kinderhook Plates were dug out of a mound near Kinderhook, Illinois, that's their name, about 75 miles south of Nauvoo in the spring of 1843. So how did this happen? There were a few men who were doing the digging. There were several onlookers, including 2 Latter-day Saints. Someone borrows the plates, ostensibly to show them to neighbors, but then hightails it to Nauvoo and gives them to Joseph Smith for him to examine and presumably to translate from. So what did they look like? That's how big they were, right? So they're not very large. They're bell-shaped, as you can see. This is the one surviving plate that we have. It's in Chicago. Here is, though, a representation of them that was done back when we had them. So this is the current extent one that's labeled here in red. That's the one that we currently have. But you'll see all of them here. So these are the Kinderhook Plates. Again, dug up 75 miles south of Nauvoo, spring of 1843, near Kinderhook, Illinois, and that's how they get their name. So Joseph Smith put them on display at his house, similar to how he put on display the papyrus and the mummies. And one of the many people who examined them there was Joseph Smith's private clerk, William Clayton. He would spend a lot of time with Joseph. He was dictating his personal journal at this time as a scribe. And here's the crux of the controversy of the Kinderhook Plates. This is from the diary of William Clayton. It says, quote, President Joseph has translated a portion, he means of the Kinderhook Plates, and says they contain the history of the person with whom they were found. And he was a descendant of Ham, the loins of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and that he received his kingdom through the ruler of heaven and earth. Okay? So the diary of William Clayton. He was around Joseph a lot at this time. Now, in 1879, William Fugate writes a letter to James Cobb, who is the stepson of Brigham Young. He'd become alienated the church, and he says, quote, I received your letter in regard to those plates, meaning the Kinderhook Plates, and I will say answer they are humbug, gotten up by Robert Wiley, Bridge Whitton, and myself. We read in Pratt's prophecy that truth would spring up out of the earth. We concluded to prove the prophecy by way of a joke. So he's talking about something that partly Pratt had written. Bridge Whitton then cut the plates out of some pieces of copper. Wiley and I made the hieroglyphics by making impressions on beeswax and filling them with acid and putting them on the plates. It's called etching. So we have someone claiming that they were a participant in a fraud, in a forgery. A surviving plate I showed you that's at the Chicago Historical Society was tested, and it was in fact etched, just as Fugate had said. So the alloy was also tested, and it's a modern copper alloy. So the plates were a forgery. They were bogus. From Richard Bushman, it just gives us kind of an overview of the situation. Joseph seemed to be stepping into the trap, but then he pulled back. After the first meeting, no further mention was made of translation, and the Kinderhook Plates dropped out of sight. Joseph may not have detected the fraud, but he did not swing into a full-fledged translation as he did with the Egyptian scrolls. The trap did not quite spring shut, which foiled the conspirators' original plan. Instead of exposing the plot immediately, as they probably intended to do, they said nothing until 1879, when one of them signed an affidavit describing the fabrication. Church historians continued to insist on the authenticity of the Kinderhook Plates until 1980, when an examination conducted by the Chicago Historical Society, possessor of one plate, proved it was a 19th century creation. So why did they do that, right? Because we have this diary from William Clayton that said President Joseph translated a portion. So we have apologists and the church itself, historians, not the church, but historians, continuing to insist on the authenticity until 1980. All right, so what's the argument? Joseph Smith made a claim, that's from Jeremy, that he could translate ancient documents. This is a testable claim. Doesn't mention Enoch being testable, right? But Joseph failed to test the Book of Abraham, and there he's talking about the facsimiles. Of course, nothing about the text of the Book of Abraham. He failed the test with the Kinderhook Plates, right? According to, let's see. Okay, so this is this will be on MormonInfographics.com. This is they don't even argue this. This is the argument that they provide. So Kinderhook Plates, hoax or history of the line of Ham. So they show the Kinderhook Plates. This is an actual plate. Joseph Smith translation. And then the hoax uncovered. In 1981, the LDS Church conceded the entire affair as a hoax. What does this tell us about Joseph Smith's gift of translation? He likes to do things with just questions and not really providing the arguments. But this is how it's presented. 1940s, this again, just to show you this isn't new, Jeremy, this isn't a new argument. Only a bogus prophet translated bogus plates. So, there's the argument laid out a little bit more succinctly. Joseph Smith did not know that the Kinderhook Plates were a fraud. A prophet or apostle will always know when presented with fraudulent artifacts. Therefore, Joseph Smith is not a prophet or apostle, right? This would be one argument from the Kinderhook Plates, right? The Spirit should have told him as a prophet or apostle that this was a fraud, right? God should be speaking to him and tell him that. Of course, we've talked about, based on our definition of a prophet or apostle from both Christian and LDS specific canonized and non-canonized sources, this is unsupported, right? We talked about how many times prophets or apostles do not receive immediate revelation. They can be wrong, right? We went through a very specific definition of this. This is just, again, false based on the definition from canonized and non-canonized sources of a prophet or apostle. How about premise A? It's most likely correct, as Bushman says, right? But not certainly. So besides the one entry from Clayton, Joseph does not produce a translation of the Kinderhook Plates, and they drop out of sight. So we're not sure, but he obviously didn't finish it. He didn't do anything else with it. So I say it's most likely correct that he didn't know they were fraud. He didn't, because he probably would have told people if they were fraud. And but it's just, again, hard to know. But he certainly didn't make any claims that they were genuine, and he didn't, provide a further translation. Okay, so how about?
Is most of that evidence that we have from William Clayton's journal entry?
No, that's it. That's the only
thing we have.
That's the only thing we have, and we're going to get to how and why that could have happened. But that's the only. Well, it's not the only mention. They talk about how they were brought up, how they, he said, "I've got the plates in our possession," and they etched them, so they have the etching, and he showed them. And then they have this meeting of, there's a group of people, we'll get to it, a group of people come, and he provides that translation to William Clayton, and then that's it. We don't have anything beyond that,
okay.
And that's what we mean by they drop out of sight. Is he doesn't say, "Hey, God told me they were fraud," but he also never does anything further with them. He never says, "Hey, these are real." We just have nothing more. So here's the second argument. So you might say, fine, okay, I get that a prophet or apostle may not always know that he's being duped, and he got duped and he didn't know, and that's fine. But he provided a translation, right? So Joseph Smith claimed to be able to translate by revelation a portion of the Kinderhook Plates. B, the Kinderhook Plates cannot be translated because they are fraud and meaningless, right? Only a bogus prophet translates bogus plates. Therefore, Joseph Smith was lying about this revelation. A prophet or apostle does not lie about receiving a revelation. Therefore, Joseph Smith is not a prophet or apostle, right? This is the main one, I would say, right? I think a lot of the critics will say, fine, you may not always know you're being spoofed, but what about that translation, right? So let's look at this a bit more closely. Joseph Smith claimed to be able to translate by revelation a portion of the Kinderhook Plates. This is from Willard Richard's journal of May 7th. We have 3 entries on this date. They're all going to provide the context, so they're really important to pay attention to. He says, in the morning, Joseph, quote, was visited by several gentlemen concerning the plates which were dug out of a mound near Quincy, and he sent by William Smith to the office for his Hebrew Bible and lexicon. Everyone knows what a lexicon is. It's a tool that you use for a secular translation. I didn't bring mine, but I have a New Testament lexicon. I don't have a Hebrew lexicon. But there's online lexicons. It'll provide different meanings of words in Hebrew or Greek or whatever. So it's a tool that is used for secular translation, right? So we have Willard Richards saying that we have several gentlemen coming to Joseph, and Joseph says, "Okay, go get my Hebrew Bible and a lexicon." Harley Pratt, also letter dated May 7th, gives us another view of this. A large number of citizens have seen them, meaning the plates, and compared the characters with those on the Egyptian papyrus, which is now in this city, and the plates, quote, are filled with engravings in Egyptian language. Finally, New York Herald for May 30th, 1843. I'll give you this is actually a picture of the article, but I'll give you the quote that I'm trying to focus in on there. This is a friendly non-Mormon living in Nauvoo that's providing this interview to the New York Herald. He says right here, he compared them in my presence with his Egyptian alphabet, which he took from the plates from which the Book of Mormon was translated. He's clearly confused about, he's not a Mormon, so he's not understanding that the Book of Mormon wasn't translated from these. But he says he compared them in my presence with his Egyptian alphabet. Compared them in my presence with his Egyptian alphabet. So here we have to do a little background. The grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language, or the Gael, Joseph Smith and his scribes left behind some sheets of paper they called a, quote, grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language that contained various Egyptian characters alongside explanations of those characters. Several of these explanations are similar to language in the Book of Abraham. A few somewhat similar documents bear different titles but contain similar or at least related information. Together, all these papers are often called the Kirtland Egyptian Papers. So if you hear the term Kirtland Egyptian Papers, this is what it's referencing. It's referencing the Gael and some other similar documents. Okay, Joseph Smith and his scribes left behind this material. So as we look at the Gale, it's clear that Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, and W.W. Phelps were products of their time when it came to the knowledge of Egyptian. These were clearly driven by Phelps. It was there's a good article. I'm not going to go a ton into the Gale, but if you're interested, I provide a resource at the top that you can read that goes through much more detail. W.W. Phelps was clearly the driver of this project. Joseph was associated with it for a time. But it's clear that they were products of their time. Why do we say that? In the early 19th century, the language was in the process of being deciphered by Champollion and others, but most people thought Egyptian was a cryptic language, each character conveying varied meanings based on the amount of knowledge possessed by the reader. Right? So you could actually, if you had more knowledge, they would have different meanings, each character. It was only after Egyptologists gained the ability to translate Egyptian using conventional methods that this notion about the language was dispelled. So it seems that Joseph Smith and his colleagues were, like others before them, hoping to figure out several levels or layers of meaning for each Egyptian symbol. Nevertheless, they failed. They produced, the document Gale that makes little sense, which is not surprising considering none of the authors claim to know or understand Egyptian, and the translation of Egyptian characters had stumped scholars for centuries. So critics will use Gale and they'll say, look, this is how he translated the Book of Abraham. And because the Gale is nonsense, which it is, the Book of Abraham must be nonsense. Like I said, it's very clear that the Gale was not used for the Book of Abraham, and you can read plenty of scholars on that. But regardless, it doesn't explain the text of the Book of Abraham, which we said was the main problem, right? How do you explain how we got all this right about the Book of Abraham? But regardless, they produce this document, the Gale, that makes very little sense. So they'll show a character from the Book of Abraham related to the papyrus, right? And then they'll show us a name that's assigned to the character and then a definition. Let me actually show you this.
That's what the Gale did?
Yeah, let me show you the Gale. It's available online now via the Joseph Smith Papers project, which is pretty awesome. So you can actually, just pull it up right here. So this is Joseph Smith Papers. Here's the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language, circa November 1835. So here it is. Here's we're on page 4 here. So let me show you. We're going to take notice of one particular character here, but I'll just show you as an example. Okay, so here's a symbol. Here's a symbol from the papyrus, right? And then they provide the name. And since it's hard to read that, let me pull it up. Here's the translation over here. So they call it Ha-E-Upa, or however you pronounce this. That's right here, right? So that's the name. Here's a symbol, name. And then notice the definition they give. Honor by birth, kingly power by the line of Pharaoh, possession by birth, one who reigns upon his throne, universally possessor of heaven, earth, and on, right? So this is the Gale. This is page 2 of the Grammar and Egyptian Alphabet. Again,
are they just making these up then, or like?
Yes, it's largely nonsense. So again, what it looked like they were trying to do was take like the Book of Abraham, and then pull the right characters out of the papyrus that they thought were being translated, and somehow form this. And like I said, Phelps was doing it, and we don't have it's nonsense. I mean, they failed, but they were essentially trying to, I think, to backdoor and figure out the language. Joseph was always interested in secular translations and learning other languages, and this was an attempt that obviously failed. All right, so here's the Gale, right? Okay, so again, go back to that boat-shaped character. Remember that boat-shaped character? All right, right there, right? When we saw the explanation that they gave. Now, let's talk about the potential source of Joseph Smith's translation of the Kinderhook Plates. I want you to look at the Kinderhook Plates, and I want you to notice on the top of a very prominent one, we have this symbol, this boat-shaped symbol that looks an awful lot like that. So look at what President Joseph Smith says. This is from Clayton, right? He was a descendant of Ham through the loins of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. This is the Ha-Ha-Pu defined in Gale. Honor by birth, kingly power by the line of Pharaoh, possession by birth. Pharaoh is, of course, in the Book of Abraham, described as a descendant of Ham. So if you're a descendant of Pharaoh, you are by definition a descendant of Ham. So honored by birth, kingly power, by the line of Pharaoh, descendant of him through the loins of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he received his kingdom from the ruler of heaven and earth. Remember the definition of Gale, one who reigns upon his throne universally, possessor of heaven and earth, and the blessings of the earth. So, a larger conclusion that we can draw is that we've got both the smoking gun, the Gale, right, that he uses to translate, and we've got an eyewitness, right, the friendly non-Mormon who says in his presence he was comparing the plates to his Egyptian alphabet. By that he meant the Gale. We also have two Mormons saying that he was calling for secular translation aids, right? We know exactly how Joseph Smith attempted to translate from the Kinderhook Plates and obtain the content that Clayton says he did. A larger conclusion then that we can draw is that Joseph Smith translated from the Kinderhook Plates not by revelation, but by non-revelatory means. So, did that make sense? We've got the three pieces of pertinent evidence here are Willard Richards' journal, right, that says that he was visited by a gentleman, he sent for a Hebrew Bible and lexicon. Some people think he meant he was calling for Hebrew Bible and his Gale and the grammar Egyptian alphabet because Pratt says that the plates are filled with engravings on Egyptian language, and they clearly have, they were trying to sketch stuff that looked like hieroglyphics, right? So Pratt says that, look, a number of citizens came, and they recognized some of this stuff, and Joseph calls for either both, one and the other, the lexicon and or the Gale. And we also have the New York Herald from, again, a friendly non-Mormon saying he compared them in my presence with his Egyptian alphabet, meaning the Gale, right? So all that he has to do is go to page 2 of the Gale, right? Find one of that prominent character on the plates, go to page 2 of the Gale, find that, and we have all the content that we need for his translation, which he provides to Clayton. So, again, going to the argument, Joseph Smith, did he claim to translate by revelation a portion of the Kinderhook Plates? He never did. He never said that the translation was given to my God. He never claims, like he does for his other translations or revelations, that they were from God. They were by revelatory means. He does not ever claim that. We have the one cryptic thing that he claimed. So this premise A is unsupported. In fact, the evidence is that Joseph was attempting a secular translation. He called for secular translation aids, the lexicon and or the Gale. Pratt and the friendly non-Mormon account in the New York Herald both assert that Joseph was attempting to use the Gale, and he could have obtained all the content that Clayton says he did from the Kinderhook Plates by just matching one of the most prominent characters from the plates and one character from the second page on the Gale.
So we have no quotes from Joseph about the Kinderhook Plates, right? We just have other people's quotes.
Yeah, and Joseph doesn't write, so we have his scribes writing. We have his scribes writing that they came up and that they saw the plates and that we have the etchings.
Mm-hmm.
The translation is from Clayton's journal,
okay,
but it's very clear that he got that from Joseph. So some people had said, for example, if you were this work on the Gale and figuring this out was actually just in the past about 10 years. And the point here, I guess, is if you're going to just freak out about something, the critical argument, and this, was a big thorn in your side for decades because of that Clayton, that Clayton thing, there's an argument for just kind of doing more research, looking at it deeper, not pulling back, not thinking, oh no, I need to bury my head in the sand, but looking at it deeper. And when you look at it deeper, oftentimes you get better and better information. So yes, Joseph never provides us any translation. We have that Clayton quote, but I think it's very clear because he was with Joseph that day. In his journal, he notes when Joseph goes out for lunch, or he goes out, he notes that he borrowed money that day. He notes that he ate lunch with Joseph. He's with him that whole day, and
but
the people
Joseph
come.
Never puts it out for everyone else and says, I translated this, you should all read it.
That's it. That's all we have.
Yeah.
So, again, I would say that premise A is entirely unsupported because we have nothing like him claiming translation by revelation, and we have a lot of evidence that he was attempting a secular translation, which then he stops doing. He either figures out it's nonsense or whatever he stops doing. So that's it. That is really the arguments from the translations: Book of Mormon, Book of Abraham, Enoch, Nun, and the Kinderhook Plates. I glossed over a number of those, but we covered them in prior sessions, so I just wanted to be, if you haven't watched it, go back and watch those 10, 11, those other ones. But that's really and so when you think about it, and when I think about the critical argument, it's extraordinarily weak from on the most important topic, which is translations. Like I said, Enoch, Book of Mormon, you have to be able to provide naturalistic explanations for those complex correspondences which are not done. Same with Abraham. Enoch's not even tried. And then we have that one quote in Clayton about Kinderhook plates, which causes people a lot of heartburn. And as you look at it deeper and deeper, I think you find pretty clearly that even if the theory about Gale and that character, which I find fairly persuasive, is incorrect, this premise is still unsupported, because he never claimed to be doing it by revelation, which he does for everything else, right? So, however he's doing it, and I think the evidence is very clear, he's attempting secular. It's still, even if you don't buy the Gale argument with the boat-shaped character, you still got to give more than more evidence that he was attempting or claiming a revelation, which he never does. So that's it. Yeah.
Did Joseph, when he got the papyrus, did he initially attempt a secular translation and then it turned into, or was his previous translations always just
Straight revelation.
The papyrus, he had never attempted to translate from Egyptian. The Book of Mormon is what he called Reformed Egyptian, and he had some experience. He would copy those characters and he sent them out for to try and get analyzed. But then after that he translates from his stone or from his hat, right? And so he's never really dealing with the plate text. So when the papyrus comes, he never, and nobody could read it. So we have no evidence that he attempted some naturalistic thing. He says, I've got these papyrus, they contain the words of Abraham, and then boom, the Book of Abraham flows out. And whether or not that was, we talked about before, whether or not it was the full Book of Abraham on the things, or it triggered the revelation process. But no, we have no evidence that he attempted to get those secularly. They couldn't. Now we can do it with the ones we have, right?
And is this the only time where he initially tried to do the secular translation, or did he have other things come up that he tried?
This is the only. Okay. I mean, no, he would. In his sermons, he would say, in the King Follett, for example, he says, the word bar, which is, create, and he uses a Hebrew lexicon to say, it means to create out of pre-existing matter. So we have minor instances. He is interested, and he tries to justify his theology based on a secular translation of the Hebrew word bar there. So he does do that, but no, not with any other text or supposedly ancient things where he provides, a secular translation of them.
Gotcha.
Cool.